This is a top-secret experimental base in the United States, a facility dedicated to conducting human experiments on death row inmates. The story takes place in a cave somewhere in Bolivia, where an event beyond human understanding has just occurred. A team led by a biological expert, along with armed forces, unexpectedly learns that there is a 250-year-old man inside the cave. If they can verify this information, it would be enough to change the world. A man carrying a bucket of fresh blood walks inside, with the armed forces following closely behind as they venture into the eerie and terrifying cave. Upon entering, they witness an unimaginable scene. A mysterious individual is imprisoned inside an iron cage. Biological expert Tim rushes forward but is stopped by the man, who mutters the words, "vampire." As Tim turns around, he is suddenly attacked. In the end, the vampire is successfully eliminated under the heavy firepower of the armed forces. However, Tim is seriously injured. Just when everyone assumes he has died, he miraculously walks out of the hospital unharmed. Even his wounds heal in an inexplicably rapid manner, far beyond the normal human recovery rate. But the next moment, Tim's teeth start to fall out. Meanwhile, a global flu outbreak is spreading at an alarming rate, with the virus expected to reach the United States within 3 months. They had to develop a vaccine as soon as possible, but the drug for the vaccine had not yet passed the tests on experimental subjects. Since culturing mammalian cells is too slow, they set their sights on human subjects instead. The terrifying-looking patient zero is none other than Tim, the biological expert who was bitten by the vampire in the cave. Now he is completely immune to the deadly virus, but this has also transformed him into a horrifying mutant. In a nearby laboratory, death row inmates from a prison are being held. They have all been injected with the mutated blood of patient zero, turning them into terrifying creatures. However, one of the young test subjects, 11, still retained his original appearance and remained completely immune to deadly diseases such as Ebola, AIDS, and measles. Daniel speculates that this must be related to age, as younger individuals have more neurons. The youngest test subject so far is already 25 years old, but Daniel believes he is still not young enough. He sets his sights on children. Meanwhile, Agent Brad is escorting death row inmate Carter to the experimental base. Clark, the head of the experiment, informs him about the next test subject. It turns out that all the experimental subjects in the lab were brought in under Brad's persuasion. However, he is unaware of the horrifying experiments being conducted inside. Brad then visits an orphan girl named Amy. Her mother had recently passed away and she has no other relatives, making her an ideal candidate for the military's experiments. Following orders from his superiors, Brad tells Amy that her mother may have contracted a certain disease and that she needs to be taken to the CDC in Colorado for testing. But Amy, being clever, sees through his deception at a glance. She grabs her belongings and escapes through the window. This scene is witnessed by Phil, who, along with Brad, gets into a car and chases after her. They eventually capture Amy in a park, making it look like a kidnapping and drawing the attention of bystanders. To avoid unnecessary trouble, Brad quickly drives away from the scene. Meanwhile, strange incidents are occurring one after another at the experimental base. Every staff member experiences nightmares featuring the mutated patient zero, Tim. It seems as though Tim has the ability to control human minds, implanting his thoughts into everyone's brain. But it is not just Tim. All the experimental subjects exhibit similar symptoms. Clark, the head of the experiment, locks eyes with Experiment 11, Shauna. That night, she appears in his dreams. What follows is a horrifying scene. Even Carter, the death row inmate who had just been brought in from prison and had never met Tim, sees Tim in his nightmare. Tim's level of danger far exceeds human imagination. At the same time, during their journey to the experimental base, Brad starts developing feelings for Amy, reminding him of his late daughter. He made a decision. He knocked out his companion in the restroom and took Amy on a journey to escape. However, he soon discovers that he has been listed as a wanted criminal for kidnapping. Fearing for Amy's safety, Brad decides to turn himself in. By doing so, he hopes to attract media attention and expose the military's experiments. But he never expects that instead of reporters, the Department of Defense arrives. Realizing the danger, they plan another escape. With Amy's help, Brad manages to obtain the key to his handcuffs. Facing an armed officer, he swiftly seizes the officer's gun. Just as he holds the officer hostage and prepares to leave, the Defense Department agents begin killing everyone in sight. During the escape, Brad is shot. Despite the pain, he manages to steal a police car and flee the scene. Once again, they embark on a journey of survival in the apocalypse. However, Brad is gravely injured and quickly becomes weak, eventually losing consciousness. Worried, Amy uses a phone to contact Brad's ex-wife, informing her of his gunshot wound and current location. Under the guidance of Dr. Lila, Amy successfully woke Brad from his coma. However, he was furious. Having served in the Marine Corps, he was well aware of their tracking methods. He immediately threw the phone out the window and headed to their next destination. Soon, they arrived at the home of Brad's friend, Lacey. Brad deliberately triggered the alarm in the shadows before raising his hands and walking forward. A woman holding a sniper rifle approached them. It turned out that during his time in the Marine Corps, Brad had been Lacey's instructor. Using her extensive connections, Lacey secured a boat for Brad, allowing them to cross the border. Lacey knew that as long as the human experiments remained a secret, the military would never stop hunting them down. However, Brad did not want to be the one to expose them. They agreed that Brad would protect Amy, while Lacey would reveal the military's experiments. Lacey meticulously documented the 12 death row inmates at the experimental base as evidence. Meanwhile, the military located Brad's lost phone through tracking and found crucial clues near the abandoned vehicle. A man arrived, claiming he was sent by the dispatch center to tow the car, but Clark immediately saw through his lie. Under brutal interrogation, the military obtained crucial information about Lacey. Just as Brad and the others were preparing to leave, alarms near Lacey's home suddenly blared. Through surveillance, they spotted 3 approaching SUVs. Sure enough, Clark and his armed forces had arrived. Brad and Lacey reunited after many years fighting side by side once again. Using the security cameras, Lacey pinpointed enemy locations and swiftly took down 2 intruding soldiers. As they were repositioning, Lacey was unfortunately hit by a sniper. After an intense firefight, Brad, overwhelmed by enemy forces, chose to surrender. His ex-wife Lila took Amy and set off for the border. Facing Clark's interrogation, Brad firmly insisted that Amy was not there and was already on her way to the border. Just as Clark was about to shoot, Amy walked out of the room alone to save Brad, leading to their capture. Meanwhile, strange events continued to unfold at the experimental base. After Carter was injected with Tim's mutated blood, he became incredibly strong. Even his previously injured cartilage miraculously healed. But soon his mind was invaded by Tim, subconsciously leading him to Shauna. As they engaged in conversation, Tim handed them 2 glasses of red wine. The strong scent of blood filled the air. Carter hesitated and politely declined, but there was a price to pay. Shauna reached out and forcibly pulled out Carter's teeth. As Carter tried to leave, Tim blocked his path. A terrifying scene unfolded. Meanwhile, a janitor cleaning the laboratory remained unaware of the lurking danger. Simmons continued to provoke Shauna, who had been injected with the mutated blood. Since the military restricted their freedom and subjected them to a suffocating environment, they found entertainment in tormenting the test subjects. Out of boredom, Simmons shoved his companion Gray toward the vampire-like creature, even kicking his ID badge into the cage on purpose. Trembling with fear, Gray had no choice but to reach in and retrieve his badge. But the next moment, horror struck. As Simmons tried to get closer to taunt her again, Shauna sank her teeth into his carotid artery. Within a minute, she drained him of blood. The entire experimental base was thrown into chaos. Since the inception of Project Noah, no test subject had ever attacked a human before. To prevent such incidents from happening again, the military decided to euthanize Shauna. Clark, the head of the experiment, was personally tasked with carrying out the execution. But they gravely underestimated the power of the mutated beings. These creatures had the ability to control the human mind. As the execution device activated, Shauna's body began to burn, causing her immense pain. Clark's mind was suddenly invaded. Shauna implanted memories of her suffering into his consciousness, manipulating his emotions. Sympathizing with her, Clark deactivated the execution device, giving Shauna another chance at life. The experiment had now spiraled far beyond what the military had anticipated. Meanwhile, Amy and Brad were brought to the experimental base, where they were placed in separate cells. After Amy's persistent demands, Nicole finally agreed to her request. With Brad by her side, Amy was injected with Tim's mutated blood. At that moment, Tim seemed to sense everything. How would he control Amy? As the nurse examined Amy's physical condition, Brad secretly took a syringe. But when they woke up from their nap, they found Tim's caretaker staring blankly at Amy. Amy was terrified. Just as the caretaker hurriedly left, Brad saw the door code and accidentally learned Tim's name from him. It turned out the caretaker had come to warn Brad to escape with Amy as soon as possible. Tim was capable of invading their minds. Before leaving, the caretaker even revealed where Tim was being held. This piqued Brad's curiosity. He grabbed a flashlight from a nearby guard. That night, Brad put his plan into action. Using the flashlight's intense beam, he avoided the surveillance cameras. Brad followed Tim's caretaker into the elevator, arriving at the laboratory where the death row inmates were held. Using the caretaker's retinal scan, he unlocked the lab doors. Inside, the atmosphere was eerily unsettling. Then, a terrifying scene unfolded. As Brad turned around, he came face to face with the horrifying Tim. Unfortunately, Dr. Lear witnessed everything. Lear restored the power, and Brad took in the shocking sight. Ordinary humans had transformed into terrifying vampires. Lear revealed the horrifying details of the experiment to him, but they were still unaware of Tim's ambition to rule the world. That night, Brad dreamed of Tim. Through research, Dr. Lear discovered that at night, the brain activity of mutated beings peaked. Tim's electromagnetic field intensity was exponentially higher than that of any other test subject. He suspected this was linked to the nightmares. Perhaps a form of evolution beyond human comprehension was taking place. Sure enough, the next day, Carter began exhibiting mutation symptoms. He developed an aversion to sunlight, lost his appetite, and his teeth started falling out. He was urgently transferred to the specialized laboratory for mutated beings. His condition was critical, with a fever reaching 40 degrees Celsius. Just as the team prepared to stabilize Carter, the laboratory mysteriously lost power. It turned out that defecting soldiers had destroyed the power station above the base. With Carter's life hanging in the balance, Brad volunteered to negotiate with the rebels. During their time in the military, Brad had been an exceptional hostage negotiator. Just as Brad was about to persuade the soldier, Clark secretly infiltrated and shot him dead. Meanwhile, Carter was undergoing physical cooling treatment. Fortunately, power was soon restored. Lear knew Carter had dreamed of Tim because moments ago, he discovered that Tim's electromagnetic pulses had surged 400 times higher than the previous day. Tim was absorbing Carter's energy, accelerating his viral mutation. Under Tim's relentless influence, Carter finally gave in. Ripping out his IV lines, he stood up like a demon and launched a frenzied attack on the humans. Lear tried to stop him but was hurled several meters away by Carter. The lab immediately went into emergency lockdown. The second vampire to attack humans had been born. Unfortunately, Lear's face was now stained with blood. The military did not stop there. Instead, they sought to weaponize the failed test subjects, enhancing their strategic arsenal. The monstrous Patient Zero was the origin of all mutations, controlling everything, including human minds. A few days ago, a soldier's mind was controlled by an experimental subject, leading to rebellion, which caught the attention of high-ranking official Gilder. He had invested a staggering $1 billion into this strategic research project. Now, the experiment had spiraled out of control. Dr. Nicole proposed halting the experiment and demanded the destruction of the experimental subjects, but Gilder refused. He was obsessed with the terrifying virus. It turned out that he had already been appointed as the Deputy Minister of Special Weapons. His purpose in coming here was to push human experimentation to the next stage, transforming failed subjects into true bioweapons. Amy had become a key target of his interest. She was exhibiting mutation symptoms, but instead of developing vampire-like traits, she had gained the ability to read human thoughts. She attempted to control minds, but her brain resisted her commands. This was exactly the result Gilder had been hoping for. He approached Amy, attempting to persuade her to join the military and become a controllable weapon. Dr. Nicole, driven by a sense of justice, was deeply disgusted by Gilder's actions. She had joined the project to eradicate diseases, but the current situation was far from what she had envisioned. Taking Amy with her, she left the room. She regretted injecting Amy with the mutated blood and decided to help Brad and Amy escape from the experimental base. After freeing Brad, Nicole led them to the blood storage facility. In an hour, the guards would change shifts, giving them a chance to reach the unloading area and escape the base. Meanwhile, in another part of the facility, Dr. Daniel was conducting a bizarre experiment on Subject 7, Winston. He drilled a hole into Winston's skull and implanted a sensory device to synchronize their brainwaves. Sure enough, Daniel and Winston began communicating on a subconscious level. Under the control of armed personnel, Winston's restraints were removed. Daniel issued subconscious commands and Winston executed them perfectly. It seemed Daniel had discovered a way to control the mutated beings. Excitement surged through him, but he had no idea that danger was already approaching. When Daniel returned to the lab for another test, something unexpected happened. Before he could install the sensory device, Winston spoke to him directly. It turned out Winston had been toying with him all along. In the next instant, Winston used his mind to release himself from the restraints. The nightmare of the experimental base had begun. Panicking, Daniel fled the laboratory, unintentionally unleashing a terrifying mutated being. He sought help from Lear, who was in isolation. Earlier, while treating test subjects, Lear had been infected with the mutated blood. For safety reasons, he had voluntarily chosen to isolate himself. But now, the situation had exceeded Lear's capabilities. Winston sank his teeth into Daniel's carotid artery, draining his blood in less than a minute before escaping from the experimental base. Unfortunately, at that moment, Brad and Amy were also attempting to flee. Sensing the danger ahead, Amy suddenly stopped in her tracks. The next second, Winston appeared directly in front of them, lunging forward and pinning Brad to the ground. Terrified, Amy let out an involuntary scream. Winston clearly felt discomfort and was thrown several meters away by the piercing sound waves, and Amy weakly collapsed into Brad's arms. Under military protection, they were taken to a safe house. Meanwhile, Winston had vanished from the heavily guarded experimental base. Yet Amy could still sense his presence, her mind flashing with disturbing images. Based on her descriptions, the military speculated that Winston was near the highway and launched a large-scale search. By this time, Winston had already begun attacking humans at will. Late at night, Lila, who had coincidentally crossed paths with Winston's escape, arrived at a house seeking help, only to find the woman inside critically wounded from an attack. Acting on her instincts as a doctor, Lila immediately treated the woman's wounds. By morning, the woman had miraculously recovered, as if she had been reborn. Her wounds had healed at an unnatural speed far beyond human comprehension. Then, a horrifying moment occurred. The infected woman suddenly transformed into a monstrous vampire and lunged at Lila. Fortunately, the military arrived just in time to save her. Clark fired multiple rounds, but the infected woman could not be killed until the sunlight hit her, finally destroying her. Meanwhile, Winston continued to evade capture. Amy, using her heightened perception, sensed his location and revealed images of a water treatment plant to the military. The military entered the location fully armed and soon encountered a mutated creature. Under heavy fire, they successfully destroyed it. But it wasn't Winston. Realizing there were more infected individuals inside, they pressed forward only to find the facility overrun with infected humans, resembling zombies. The fallen corpse suddenly stood up again. At this point, Winston had reached the outside, and a soldier was attacked and killed. His real target, however, was Amy. To protect Lila, Amy was forced into a desperate chase with Winston. She fled into a nearby warehouse, but in the dim lighting, Winston grabbed her by the throat and lifted her into the air. Summoning her strength, Amy pushed over a shelf, knocking Winston back and freeing herself. Just as she ran out of options, Brad arrived in time to save her. The moment Winston was destroyed, the infected humans at the water treatment plant also collapsed. It became clear that the infected were linked to their primary host. Eliminating the mother figure would wipe out the others. Back at the experimental base, strange events continued to unfold. Tim was still invading human minds. Lear, the very creator of the virus, felt immense guilt for the innocent lives lost. Determined to correct his mistake, he secretly planned to destroy the test subjects without informing the military. But before he could begin, the soldiers who had been out searching returned to the base. To buy time, Nicole decided to cover for Lear, while Lear carried out the destruction plan alone. After activating the device, under the intense light, the infected began to show signs of discomfort. Their faces burned and they writhed in agony. At the same time, Amy, who had been injected with Tim's blood, started showing symptoms. As Lear increased the temperature, the mutant's pain intensified. Then, Nicole accidentally learned from Clark that when the escaped test subjects were killed, the infected humans also perished. She suddenly realized that destroying Patient Zero would mean the death of all those injected with his blood, including those who hadn't yet mutated. They immediately called off the destruction as there were still unmutated test subjects in the base. Due to the massive casualties caused by the escaped mutants, the incident drew the attention of top military officials. However, instead of shutting down the project, they granted ultimate authority to the ruthless Gilder. Tim continued to mentally torment the test subjects. Elizabeth's fever spiked past 40 degrees Celsius, and it kept rising. Anyone injected with Tim's mutated blood faced a terrifying choice: either die or submit to Tim and become one of his kind. In the end, Elizabeth chose death. In her husband Lear's arms, she took her last breath. Lear was consumed by guilt. He had created the virus, yet he couldn't even save his own wife. Tim seemed to sense everything. He immediately targeted his next victim, Amy, invading her subconscious. Amy had already begun mutating. Her teeth started falling out. They had to develop an anti-serum quickly, or Amy would turn into a blood-sucking monster. Meanwhile, Clark noticed something suspicious. A temporary caretaker at the base seemed to have unrestricted access to all areas. Reviewing surveillance footage, he identified the caretaker as Gray. Sure enough, Gray was behaving strangely. He was sabotaging the base's communication systems. By the time Clark arrived, it was too late. The base had lost all contact with the outside world. Gray had been under Tim's control all along. Clark also learned from him about Tim's plan to change the world and that each infected subject in the laboratory was controlling a specific human. Clark immediately brought Gray before Gilder and demanded answers about the unauthorized access privileges. But at this moment, Gilder was unaware. Under Clark's threats, he learned that a security advisor named Martinez had reset the system. But no matter how hard Clark searched, Martinez was nowhere to be found. Even the logistics director had never heard of him, making Clark realize the severity of the situation. Through further investigation, he pieced everything together. Gilder's so-called security consultant was actually one of the mutated beings inside the lab. It had manipulated Gilder into resetting the base's security systems, allowing the infected to escape. To prevent a catastrophe, Clark activated the toxic gas in the isolation chamber, temporarily rendering the mutants unconscious. But now, Gray, who was under control, seemed like a completely different person. Ignoring the pain, he violently broke free from his restraints and continued carrying out Tim's mission. Meanwhile, Nicole successfully developed the antidote. But just as she was about to save Amy, the lab door was locked, and no matter how hard she tried, it wouldn't open. It turned out that Gray, under control, was outside. Tim's plan was clear. He wanted to stop the rescue and ensure that Amy joined his ranks. Gray also obtained the key to the isolation chamber from Gilder. Just as Gray was about to activate the device, Amy suddenly woke up. At the same moment, the infected inside the chamber also stirred. The nightmare had begun. Gray completed Tim's mission, unlocking the security doors of the mutated beings. The terrifying vampire-like creatures were unleashed. Brad carried Amy as they evacuated the facility, dragging the heartless Gilder along with them. Just as Tim was about to escape, Brad managed to slam the gates shut, but it was clear that the iron doors wouldn't hold for long. Amy's pupils suddenly changed in a disturbing way. At that moment, the secret U.S. bioweapons research base was overrun. A group of death row inmates injected with the mutant virus broke free, unleashing chaos upon humanity. Brad, wielding an M4 assault rifle, fired relentlessly. But no matter how many rounds he emptied, the mutants charged forward at terrifying speeds. They moved like zombies, unstoppable and nearly indestructible. During the escape, Lila was unfortunately infected. With Brad's cover fire, she was successfully rescued, a heavy iron door temporarily holding back the infected. But Lila was critically wounded. After ensuring the others reached the elevator safely, Brad ventured back into the lab alone. A doctor was still being held inside, and more importantly, the antidote that could save Lila was there. Meanwhile, Nicole managed to free herself and unlock the sealed laboratory doors. But in the next moment, terror struck. A mutated test subject dropped from above, landing right in front of her. They were separated only by a table, the atmosphere tense to the point of suffocation. Just in time, Brad arrived and rescued Nicole. Under suppressive fire, they successfully drove the mutant away. Just as they prepared to leave with the antidote, the ground command unit suddenly detected mutants approaching them. With nowhere to run, they locked themselves inside Tim's isolation chamber. By then, the mutants had completely surrounded them, their expressions twisted in hunger and rage. Hearing of their predicament, Gilder coldly ordered the self-destruction protocol to be initiated. Clark, however, refused to give up. Desperately, he searched for another exit from the base. Clark forcibly restrained Lear, who was trying to detonate the bomb. Meanwhile, Amy crept toward the computer. This was the only way to destroy the test subjects once and for all. She activated the self-destruct system. The lab would detonate in 2 minutes. Flashing red warning lights illuminated the lower levels of the facility. The mutants seemed to sense the impending explosion. They scattered, trying to flee. As the countdown reached the final minute, the ground technical team discovered a hidden passage leading to the surface within the otherwise airtight base. Following their instructions, Brad and Nicole found the exit. As they smashed through the wall, 2 mutants closed in on them. Nicole handed the antidote to Brad, choosing to stay behind and hold them off. At this moment, only 15 seconds remained until the explosion, leaving no time for them to escape the base together. With Clark's help, Brad successfully escaped, injecting the antidote into Lila's body. The next moment, her wounds miraculously healed. But just as everyone thought the virus had been destroyed in the lab, they were unaware that a bloodbath was about to begin. On the first floor, the guards had all been slaughtered. Amy sensed the presence of the infected. Sure enough, the creatures were slowly closing in. So Clark decided to lead a strike team, using the lights as cover to clear a path for Brad and the others. At last, they successfully escorted Brad, Amy, and the recovered Lila out of the base. With Lacey's support, Brad drove toward the CDC with Amy and Lila, who had been injected with the antidote. Unfortunately, Clark was struck by a mutant and thrown violently to the ground as the vampire-like creatures continued their ruthless slaughter of humans. Meanwhile, Lacey arrived at the experimental base. To prevent the infection from spreading further, she eliminated all the infected soldiers. At the same time, the mutants launched an all-out assault on the surrounding cities. a massive wave of infected individuals flooded into urban areas, far exceeding the military's ability to contain them. The city ultimately fell into complete chaos.